Ideological contradictions contribute to the transformation of allies into enemies. The split of the Allied powers and the start of the Cold War. Germany's role in these events. While the crisis between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia attracted widespread attention, it remained, in essence, a regional confrontation. In the heart of Europe, a much larger confrontation was unfolding. In defeated Germany, the competing ideologies of the Western Allies and the Kremlin dictator, Joseph Stalin, threatened to transform a fragile peace into a global conflict. The victorious Allied powers divided the defeated Germany into 4 occupation zones, administered by the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Although Berlin itself was deep within the Soviet zone, it, too, was divided among the 4 powers. Officially, the future of Germany was to be decided jointly by the Allies. In reality, the Allied powers had already begun to disintegrate. Growing distrust between Moscow and the Western powers made the creation of a unified German state increasingly unlikely. The Soviet occupation zone quickly became a field of communist transformation. Political life fell under the authority of the Soviet military administration. German officials had only limited powers, while key positions in the police, security services, and local governments were entrusted to loyal German communists. Sweeping land reforms confiscated large estates without compensation. Major industries, banks, and insurance companies were nationalized or brought under direct Soviet control. But political repression and the forced introduction of a communist pseudo-economy were only part of the Soviet transformation. The advance of the Red Army into Germany was accompanied by one of the largest waves of sexual violence in modern European history. Historians estimate that approximately 2 million German women were raped by Soviet soldiers during and after the war. The mass sexual violence aimed at psychologically demoralizing intended to create a feeling among the occupied German population of absolute dominance of the Soviet occupiers over them. After the Second World War, Germany suffered devastating territorial losses. The Soviet Union and Poland annexed extensive German territories. Between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans fled or were expelled from these regions, as well as from the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, in one of the largest forced migrations in European history. Millions arrived in occupied Germany without food, shelter, or fuel. Under the Hague Convention of 1907, the occupying powers were responsible for maintaining public order and providing for the civilian population. However, Germany faced catastrophic shortages. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allies agreed that the Soviet Union would receive industrial equipment dismantled from the Western occupation zones. In return, the Kremlin accepted obligations to supply the Western zones with food, coal, timber, fertilizers, and petroleum products. However, Soviet deliveries were extremely limited and were quickly halted, contributing to the spread of hunger during the difficult years of 1946 and 1947, known in Germany as the Hunger Years. In response, in early May 1946, the United States halted shipments of industrial reparations from the RUR to the Soviet Union. The decision deepened the growing confrontation. The Kremlin accused the Western Allies of violating international agreements and launched an extensive propaganda campaign against American policy. Cooperation among the occupation authorities rapidly deteriorated. Meanwhile, the administration of the Western occupation zones worked on the political and economic integration of the German lands and the creation of democracy there. In October 1945, the American occupation authorities established the Council of States to coordinate legislation across Bavaria, Hesse, and Württemberg-Baden. Then, on the 1st of January 1947, the American and British occupation zones merged into the Bizone, creating a unified economic administration designed to accelerate recovery. On the 1st of August 1948, the French zone later joined the arrangement, forming what became informally known as Trizones. On the 23rd of May 1949, the Trizones became the Federal Republic of Germany, commonly known as West Germany. The decisive turning point in the Trizones' economy occurred on the 20th of June 1948. The Western Allies implemented a major currency reform, replacing the rapidly depreciating Reichsmark with the new Deutsche Mark. The reform stabilized the economy almost immediately. The Kremlin perceived the Western Allies' actions as sabotage. On the 24th of June 1948, the Soviet Union completely closed its borders with Bizone. Food and fuel supplies to West Berlin by rail and road were blocked. The Western Allies responded with the famous Berlin airlift, delivering food and fuel by air until the Soviets lifted the blockade on the 12th of May 1949. The crisis marked one of the first major victories of the Western Alliance in the emerging Cold War. The ideological conflict between Western Allies and the Kremlin dictator persisted. In February 1946, the U.S. diplomat George F. Kennan, serving in Moscow, sent Washington what became known as the Long Telegram. Kennan argued that Soviet foreign policy was shaped by ideological hostility to capitalism and the Soviet leadership's need to invoke external threats to justify its authoritarian rule. He concluded that lasting cooperation with the Soviet regime was impossible and recommended a strategy of firm, patient containment. His analysis profoundly influenced U.S. foreign policy. In March 1947, President Harry Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, pledging American support for governments resisting communist expansion or external pressure. This was followed by the Marshall Plan, an unprecedented program of economic reconstruction that helped rebuild Western Europe. 2 years later, in 1949, the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, the permanent military alliance intended to deter Soviet aggression. In mid-May 1955, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact, which was a military alliance between the Soviet Union and 7 Eastern Bloc countries. Created as a counterweight to NATO, it was primarily used by Kremlin to maintain political dominance over its satellite states and justify military interventions in the region. Long before these policies took shape, however, one speech had already captured the changing reality. On the 5th of March 1946, at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered his famous address, The Sinews of Peace, commonly known as the Iron Curtain speech. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, Churchill declared, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. His speech clearly captured the political situation in Europe at the time, divided into 2 opposing ideological camps. After a few years, that division became permanent. In 1949, 2 German states emerged. In the west, within the territory of Trizones, stood the Federal Republic of Germany, built on parliamentary democracy and a market economy. In the east, within the Soviet occupation zone, the German Democratic Republic, also known as East Germany, emerged as a typical communist dictatorship and a Soviet satellite state. The Cold War had begun. The rivalry spread far beyond Europe, escalating into proxy wars across the globe. The first major battlefield was in Korea. There, East and West confronted one another in a brutal conflict that claimed millions of lives. Only the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 finally brought the Korean War to an end, marking the end of the first major military conflict of the Cold War. By then, the division of Europe had become the defining reality of the 20th century.